The year is 490 BC, and 25,000 Persian invaders race up the beach at the Bay of Marathon. Meeting them are 10,000 outnumbered Greek defenders. The Persian and Athenian animosity dates back to 493 BC. Athens had successfully backed the revolt of Ionia in present-day Turkey. This would enrage the Persian king Darius, who with expansionist plans would wait to take his revenge. The opportunity presented itself 3 years later. The Athenians had overturned their king, Hippias, who fled to Persia. With the former Athenian king as an advisor, King Darius began to marshal a huge army from all corners of his empire. His intent was to reinstall Hippias as his puppet upon the Athenian throne, and probably the rest of Greece. As this army gathered, the Athenians sent a day runner to Sparta asking for their aid. The runner, Thidippides, ran the 150 miles between the two cities in under 3 days. The Spartans, however, stated they were celebrating one of their many religious holidays and would march after it was over. This was likely a convenient excuse, as the Spartans hated the other Greeks and weren't in a rush to assist them. They also had the very real concern of their slaves, called helots, revolting should they march their entire army away from home. So Sparta would sit this one out. Hippias informed the Persians of the perfect place to land their army, which was borne by 600 ships. The plains of Marathon were wide open and ideal for the cavalry and light infantry that Persians were known for. The Athenians marched to meet them. For 4 days, the two armies faced each other in a standoff. The Greeks in a strong hilly position waiting for the Spartan reinforcements. The Persians arraying their men and hoping those Greeks still loyal to Hippias would rise up. The Persians, however, gambled on a quick victory. Under cover of darkness, they reloaded their cavalry and some infantry back into the ships, and began a 10-hour journey around the peninsula to assault Athens directly. Half the army, some 12,000 men, were left at Marathon.
At this point, both sides were reluctant to force an engagement. Despite Persia's superior numbers and flexible army composition, the Greeks boasted a strong defensive position in the hills, with both of their flanks secure. The bristling spears of the Greek phalanx also presented a very persuasive argument against a direct assault. And likewise, the widely feared heavy cavalry and trained archers of the Persians presented an equally persuasive argument against a Greek assault across the plain. A retreat back to the safety of Athens' walls might have made strategic sense at this point, but it was politically unsafe. Miltiades and Callimachus knew that there was a strong faction in Athens that supported Persia and wanted to turn the city over in exchange for mercy and political power for themselves. The commanders needed a decisive victory over the Persians at Marathon to silence these sympathizers. Retreat was not an option. And so the two armies simply waited, staring each other down for 8 days straight. This delay benefited the Greeks much more than the Persians, as every day they waited brought the Spartan army closer, and the Persians only had so much food to sustain their large army. What finally broke the stalemate is uncertain. Ancient sources are divided on the details, and modern historians haven't been able to reach a consensus either. We do know two things though: that the Greeks most likely attacked the Persians, and the Persian cavalry was not present for the battle. The question of where the Persian horses went has been debated by scholars for centuries, and there are two main theories. The cavalry was either re-embarked, or it had been sent away from the rest of the army to forage. Equally uncertain is why the Greeks chose to attack when they did. Ancient sources, again, contradict each other, but it is likely that something forced the Greeks to attack, be it the threat to Athens from the Persians re-embarking, or seeing an opportunity in the cavalry being sent away. Whatever the case, the cavalry was gone, and Miltiades seized the initiative. He ordered the army into formation, stretching out his forces to match the width of the Persian line by thinning the center ranks and concentrating his troops on the flanks. The long line and thickened flanks were meant to prevent the larger Persian army from enveloping the smaller Greek force in melee. If the Greeks were surrounded, they would be slaughtered. Having arranged his forces, Miltiades promptly began the attack. The Greeks marched steadily across most of the 1,500-meter or 4,900-foot gap between them and the Persians. Then, upon entering the roughly 200-meter or 650-foot effective range of the Persian archers, the Greeks surprised the Persians by breaking into a full run toward the enemy. Thanks to their large shields, armor, and the momentum of their charge, the Greeks were able to shrug off most of the Persian arrows as they ran, and soon entered melee with the enemy. For a moment, it seemed as though Miltiades' attack would fail, however. Since the Greek center ranks were thinner, the Persians were able to break through the line there and push forward. But the thicker Greek flanks succeeded in starting a rout, allowing them to attack the advancing Persian force from the sides and the rear, enveloping them. A happy accident. Miltiades' tactic to avoid envelopment by the Persians had allowed the Greeks to envelop their enemies instead, and soon they inflicted heavy losses by doing so. The envelopment broke the Persians' morale, and soon a rout among the entire Persian force started, as they quickly began retreating to their ships. All the while, the Greeks continued to slaughter them. By the time the Persians had withdrawn, 6,400 of them lay dead, by either drowning in the nearby marsh to escape, or by being cut down in the retreat. By comparison, the Athenians lost a measly 192 men. But among the Greek dead was the polemarch Callimachus, who, according to legend, died with so many Persian spears through his body that he remained upright after death. Though the Greeks had won a remarkable victory at Marathon, they had no time to celebrate. The rest of the Persian army was now sailing toward a defenseless Athens, and the Greeks had to march through the night to make it back to the city in time to protect it. They arrived just in time to see the Persian ships approaching. Finding the city fully defended, Dades turned his fleet around and abandoned the expedition, ending the First Greco-Persian War. While the Persian expedition had successfully annihilated Eretria and expanded the territory of the Persian Empire, the surprising victory by the Athenians at Marathon carried huge symbolic importance. The Athenians capitalized on this, using widespread propaganda across the Greek world to inflate the importance of their relatively minor victory. As a result, the influence and prestige of Athens grew exponentially after Marathon, propelling them to prominence among the city-states of Greece.
As the young Persian Empire expanded towards Europe in the 6th century BC, Greece and Asia Minor were caught in the Persian sphere of influence. At the same time, the Greek city-states had become an influential power in these regions themselves. In 499 BC, Athens supported an uprising of the Ionian Greeks against the Persians in Asia Minor. The Persians were greatly angered by this intervention and launched a punitive attack in 490 BC. This attack was repelled by the Athenians in the famous Battle of Marathon. The young Persian king Darius I was infuriated by this defeat and planned revenge. However, this was delayed by internal problems such as revolutions, so that only his successor Xerxes I picked up his plans to invade Greece. The Greeks got scent of this plan and gathered at Corinth in 481 BC, where they forged an alliance which was led by the Spartans. But it was the Athenian Themistocles who came up with a defense plan. The Greeks should hold at two crucial locations. At Artemisium, the fleet should hold the sea, and at Thermopylae, the land forces should hold the mountain pass. The Greeks chose these two locations because they were heavily outnumbered and stood a much better chance against the Persian army when fighting in narrow terrain, where the Persians couldn't deploy their full force at once.
King Xerxes, the son of Darius, leads his people against the Greeks. King Leonidas, meaning lion's son, leads the Greek response. The Spartans were the most fearsome of the Greek city-states, and as such were chosen to lead the coalition's army. The Spartan Council of Elders refused to support the war, however, due to statedly religious observances, but more likely due to isolationism. One thing to consider here is that the Spartans neither liked nor were liked by the other cities. There was also the practical concern of all their slaves called helots. Sending a large army far away would be inviting a slave revolt, so Leonidas led his 300 bodyguards and their slaves on a walk to Thermopylae, where they took command of the Greek force. Approaching the pass from the other side is the largest army ever assembled at the time. Estimates vary wildly, but approximately 150,000 Persians marched to meet the 7,000 Greek defenders. Armament. The Greek hoplites fielded long spears and short swords. The Persians had a mismatch of weapons. Advantage, Greeks. Defenses. The hoplites wore metal armor head to toe and had a large metal shield. The Persians wore cloth and wicker. The Spartans also had fortifications. Decisive advantage to the Greeks. Utility. The Greeks had short supply lines. The Persians relied on pre-placed food caches, and with a massive army to feed, could not play the waiting game and must attack or starve. The Greeks arrived first and set to work rebuilding an old defensive wall constructed at the pass previously. As the Persians arrived, the Greeks went out building campfires to kick up as much smoke and light as possible to conceal their numbers. For the next 4 days, the Persians would send forward scouts and emissaries, at first thinking the Greek force was a joke or a negotiation tactic. It was not until the 5th day of their arrival that the assault began. The first day of fighting went well for the Greeks. Xerxes sent forward his weakest and most expendable forces. By the end of the day, only a few Greeks were killed, but tens of thousands of Persians had died. Crashing against the disciplined shield line with their lightly armored force was not working for the Persians, and they could not leverage their exceptional cavalry or numbers due to the tight beach battlefield. Fighting from atop the small wall the Greeks had constructed, they were almost unassailable. They stabbed down and mercilessly killed any Persian who tried to scramble up the wall. The pass was also narrow enough that the Greeks could have units in reserve, resting, then rotate out as the front units got tired. The Persians unleashed tens of thousands of arrows, but the light arrows against Greek armor were ineffective. On the second day, the situation repeated itself until Xerxes sent in his elite immortals, so named because when one would die, another would immediately be promoted to replace him. After a bit of a clash with them, the Greeks pulled a fast one. They feigned retreat, falling back in lockstep. When the immortals broke their formation and darted after them, the Greeks suddenly reformed into a solid wall and cut down the now spread out Persians. While the Greeks suffered more losses than the first day, the Persians lost another 10,000 or so men. This simply wasn't working. The Persians had to find a way to leverage their numbers, and one soon presented itself. Ephialtes, a Greek farmer, revealed the location of a narrow mountain pass the Persians could use to bypass Thermopylae. The pass was guarded by Phoenicians. As the Persians approached, they withdrew to the high ground and made ready for battle. However, the Persians ignored them and made their way through the pass. In the morning, the Greeks would face assault from both sides, allowing the Persians to leverage their superior numbers. The Greeks had two choices: retreat or stay and die. The bulk of the Greeks retreated. However, some 1,500 men chose to stay. This may have been due to a sense of duty, but there was also a practical reason. Remember how I said the Persians had exceptional cavalry? Well, if they were allowed through the pass, they would be able to run down the retreating Greeks. So a rear guard was necessary to delay them a day and allow the retreating Greeks to slip away. This selfless sacrifice, led by the 300 Spartans, would become something of a myth. But it was also a necessity to save the rest of the army, rather than some grand gesture of defiance. The third day came, and the Greeks attacked, determined to kill as many Persians as possible before they were surrounded. While there was one hell of a fight, they all died, killed by Persian sword and arrows. The Persians now advanced towards Athens and burned it to the ground. While Persian occupation would last a year, they were finally driven from Greece following the battles of Plataea and Macao.
The Persian Empire had already launched its invasion of the Greek territory. Without finding much resistance, they kept subduing the Greek city-states along the way. But the route towards the domination of Greece would not be as easy as the Persians had forecasted. Many Greek cities came together to halt the Persian horde's advance. Over land, the Spartans tried to contain them in the gorge of Thermopylae. At sea, the Athenian fleet and its allies would play a decisive role. The Athenians were led by Themistocles, who, for more than 10 years before, had managed to convince the citizens of Athens of the importance of edifying a strong fleet, because he knew that the victory of the Greeks over the Persians at the Battle of Marathon was just the first of several that would follow. His war vessels were known as triremes, since they had 3 tiers of rowers, and they were the very best in terms of war vessels. In an initial stage, the fleet would give coverage to the Spartans who fought on land, hence preventing the Persian navy to disembark their troops in the rear of the Greeks fighting at Thermopylae. However, after the fall of Leonidas and his 300, Themistocles ordered his fleet to return to Athens. After having surpassed the Spartan blockade, the Persian army kept going and conquered city after city until they reached the gates of Athens. The city, for the most part, had been almost completely evacuated, aware that anyone who opted for staying in the city would be accepting their death sentence. Xerxes invaded the city, pillaging everything that he could and destroying everything that was left behind. He had fulfilled his father's wish to burn Athens to ashes. But his victory was not yet complete. The Athenian navy had to be defeated as well. The fleet was docked at the Straits of Salamis, near Athens. Themistocles found himself in a difficult situation. The ship ratio was 2-1 in favor of the Persians. Even though the Greeks had modern vessels, the Persian fleet was formed by experienced Phoenician and Egyptian sailors. Victory seemed impossible to reach. But Themistocles was already a thorough connoisseur of Persian strategies and realized that they always preferred to avoid direct and difficult clashes. They were always prone to rely on betrayals to streamline their paths. That was the situation in Miletus and Thermopylae, and so Salamis would not be any different. But this time, Themistocles would use a betrayal to his advantage. He sent his reliable servant on a mission to deceive Xerxes. The Greek man pretended to be a traitor and said he had valuable information to the Persians, which he would share in exchange for a reward. The Persians were curious to know what the traitor had to say. He disclosed the place where the Greek fleet was hidden, saying that the troops were disorganized and on the brink of defection. The Persian intelligence, with its clever spies, already knew that the Greek leaders were fighting between themselves, and they glimpsed a repetition of the Battle of Lade, where the Greeks deserted during the fight, granting an easy victory to the Persians. Xerxes decided to send his great fleet for an attack against Greece and end the Greek navy once and for all. The Persian navy had bitten the bait of Themistocles and headed towards the Straits of Salamis. When entering the straits, the Persian vessels were astounded. What should have been a jumbled enemy was actually an opponent established in battle formation and motivated to stand up for their land. Akin to the Battle of Thermopylae, the Straits of Salamis neutralized the numerical advantage of the Persian vessels, as there was not much space to maneuver. The battle started, and the Greeks attacked the Persian vessels with the rams of bronze. Many Persian vessels sunk right away. Those that managed to resist the impact were then approached, and a one-on-one fight would take place on the decks of the ships. The Greek vessels were more maneuverable, and so they started encircling the Persians. Even though the Persians had many ships, they got stuck, and so they started to collide and cause damage onto their own allies. Xerxes watched everything from a throne placed on top of the hill. He could not believe what was happening. The Persian war vessels were being sunk one by one. Thousands of soldiers were drowning or struggled for their lives amid the ships. The Persian men who could swim up to the beach were as unlikely as those who drowned, because, on the shores, Greek hoplites were ready to kill those who made it to the beach. The Persian defeat became evident after they lost 1/3 of their fleet, and so the admiral ordered a retreat. The Greek victory was decisive. Now Themistocles and his ships ruled the seas of Greece. Winter was coming. War would have to wait. Xerxes decided that the ruined city of Athens was no place for the king of the world, and so he decided to return to Asia. Nonetheless, a considerable part of his gigantic army stayed under the command of General Mardonius, having the mission to dominate the rest of Greece.